Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello. Welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. Well, summer is officially over. Now that September has arrived, we are back to our weekly scheduled programs. I know. I was supposed to put out an episode every 2 weeks during the summer, but, well, the summer got away from me. One of my boys got into a car accident and totaled his car, and then my baby boy, my youngest, my little man, went to college. Oh, and we had some issues with the internet here. We'll talk about that in a moment. I am now officially an empty nester. I have plans. I have many plans for my house and all the rooms in it. I just can't put all of those plans into play just yet. The two that are in college still have their rooms here with their stuff, so I just have to be patient. But I do have plans. The one who totaled his car is okay now. A few weeks of physio and he still has some back pain, but he's alive and walking, so that's good. And my internet, well, I won't name the provider that I use, but I will say this. I'm sure that if I had a penis, it would have been fixed by now. Oh, that's right. It's still not completely fixed. We have to run a fan on our modem 24/7, or else it overheats and starts dropping the internet over and over again all day and all night. I called my provider 5 times telling them that we needed a new modem, and I still don't have one. I'm going to start working on lowering my voice, changing my name to Barney, and then I'll call and tell them I need a new modem. I'd bet I'll get a new modem within a day. Anyways, I hope you've had a wonderful and safe summer. Let's get the business out of the way, shall we? If you like this episode or any episode, please head on over to the Patreon page and give the show some love. For less than a pumpkin spice latte, you can help me continue bringing you episodes each week. You can also support the show on Spotify, and don't forget to give the show a 5-star review over on Apple. Apparently it helps the show in the algorithm, which is something I just don't understand. Like, follow, and share the show on whatever platform you're listening to. Stop by our Facebook page or YouTube page and leave a comment, or share a post with everyone you know, or don't know for that matter. Everyone is welcome here. Send a suggestion for a future episode, or just drop a line and say hi at thebitterwitness@gmail.com. That's enough of the business. Let's get to this week's case. I have spent almost 2 weeks writing this episode for you guys today to make up for the missing episodes from the summer. I thought we would start the fall season, my favorite time of year, with a gigantic, enormous case. The dogs are sleeping behind me, so puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper this week. So grab a cup of tea and a big, big bottle of something strong, because this is a horrible case. Sit back, relax, while I tell you about the case of the Port Arthur Massacre. As always, I want to give the victims in the case top billing, but as in many of our cases, we have many, many victims. So, to all those affected by this horrific case, and to all their loved ones, I acknowledge you and send my love to you wherever you may be. The deeply ingrained instinct to shield one's child is amplified when a parent faces the reality of their child's blatant challenges. There's a natural yearning for that child to navigate the world with the same ease as their peers, to simply exist as all the other children do, on the playground and in life in general. This profound desire, often intertwined with a pervasive sense of parental guilt can drive a parent to do anything and everything to smooth life's path, to make existence easier for their struggling child. Yet, in a tragic irony, this very overprotection, fueled by the most loving and pure of intentions, can inadvertently cause more harm than good. Fostering an environment where growth is stunted or negative traits are allowed to flourish unchecked. Today's case shows just how a parent orchestrating a fragile bubble of existence around their son can in fact cripple their son's ability to truly engage in the world, leaving the child with nothing but feelings of rage and disconnect, along with an inability to actually function within society. Our case this week is taking us to Tasmania in Australia. Tasmania is the smallest state of Australia. Its capital city, Hobart, is located right at the base of Mount Wellington. Our case takes us to Port Arthur, which is a small town about 97 kilometers southeast of Hobart. Port Arthur is known for once being a convict settlement. The convict settlement was established in September of 1830. Those criminals deemed as the most hardened of criminals, or those who reoffended, as well as similar types of prisoners from Britain, were transported to be incarcerated at the Port Arthur prison. This prison was known to have the most strictest of policies and procedures in place. The convicts were put to work logging and milling timber to produce wood planks needed for government jobs. The prison was classified as a separate prison, which was designed from a theory from Jeremy Bentham, who perhaps is my favorite philosopher and is the reason for the panopticon. The panopticon symbolized a shift in types of punishments used on convicts. Instead of using brute physical abuse on convicts in an attempt at rehabilitation, such as whippings or literal beatings, the panopticon used psychological punishment to attempt to rehabilitate a prisoner. The panopticon, designed by Bentham, and yes, my cat is named Bentham after Jeremy Bentham, was designed with a central column, kind of like a silo, and the prison was built around this column. From the inside of the column, all spaces where a convict could access could be watched: yards, hallways, and cells. You see, Bentham's big thing was choice, personal choice. Basically, he felt that a criminal would choose to do the right thing if they knew there was a chance that they were being watched at any time. But the genius to Bentham's design was that the prisoners would not be able to see whether the guards were watching them or not. Bentham's theory was that having the constant threat of being caught doing something they weren't supposed to be doing would in itself be enough to stop the criminal from committing offenses. Bentham's theory goes way deeper, and maybe one day I might do an episode on him because he is really cool. But this is just the Coles Notes version. The separate prison was completed in 1853, but the prison layout didn't include all aspects of Bentham's designs. The layout was in the shape of a cross, with exercise yards at each corner. The prisoner wings were each connected to a surveillance core of the prison. From the surveillance hub in the center, guards could watch every inch of the wings, but not the individual cells. This prison was one of the original mindfuck prisons, as I like to call them. Firstly, The location of the prison was literally surrounded by shark-filled waters, and if you escaped and didn't take the route filled with giant sharks, who would basically use you as a toothpick, you could try making it on foot through the desert-like terrain filled with all the other poisonous snakes and spiders and scorpions and crocodiles and God knows whatever else animal that will kill you in the Australian outback. That was, if you were able to make it past the armed guards and attack dogs that patrolled the outside of the prison 24 hours a day. As well, food was used to reward well-behaved prisoners and as punishment for troublemakers. When prisoners were well-behaved, they would receive larger amounts of food, or even items that were considered luxurious, such as tea, sugar, and tobacco. When a prisoner caused issues for the guards or other prisoners, they would receive the bare minimum of bread and water. Another program, for lack of a better word, implemented at the prison was the silent system. With this, the prisoners had thick, dark hoods placed over their heads and were made to stay silent for hours. This was supposed to allow time for the prisoner to reflect upon the actions which had put them in this situation. But many of these prisoners developed mental illness from the lack of light and sound. By 1877, Port Arthur was falling apart, literally. The government had abandoned the prison and left the prison to crumble into obscurity. After years of decay and neglect, Port Arthur, the town, being a coastal town, was able to create a booming fishing industry, which in turn helped to grow a thriving tourist industry. The prison ruins were quite the draw, and many tourists started flocking to the beautiful beach and surrounding areas. By the summer of 2010, the area was boasting that Port Arthur had drawn more than 250,000 tourists per year, and it was designated as an UNESCO World Heritage Site. Which I had no idea what that meant, so I went to the magic Google box and I discovered that an UNESCO World Heritage Site is a landmark or area with cultural, historical, or scientific significance that has been officially recognized by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, for its outstanding universal value. These sites are considered to be part of the common heritage of humanity and are protected under an international treaty, meaning that UNESCO works with the signatory countries to protect these sites through legal, scientific, and financial means, ensuring their preservation for future generations to have the ability to visit and learn from. Some examples of other World Heritage Sites: Quebec City, the Great Barrier Reef, the pyramids at Gaza, and the Taj Mahal. Just a little background on the location for our case this week. But even with the reincarnation of the town of Port Arthur, I'm sure there are still some ghosts of tortured souls that wander aimlessly. Martin Bryant was born on May 7, 1967. His parents, Maurice and Carleen Bryant, had 2 children, Martin and his younger sister Mindy. They lived in Newtown, which is a suburb of the Tasmanian capital of Hobart. Maurice worked as what is called a waterside worker, or a wharfie, and what they do is they move cargo from ship to shore. Carleen was a housewife. When Martin was an infant, he was delayed in speech. According to Carleen, Martin had a hard time forming friendships and relationships with others, and that he quite often was destructive. For example, according to Carleen, he would break his toys and then leave the pieces strewn about the house. By the time Martin was 16 months old, he was running, climbing, and escaping, or wandering, as his mother might describe it. Martin would disappear regularly from their house. One time they found him on top of the next-door neighbor's chicken coop. Another time they found him at a park, quietly and happily swinging on a swing. The thing about this was that the park they found Martin at, was located on the other side of some well-used train tracks. His mother, Carlene, came up with the only solution she could think of at the time. I started to leave him on the house veranda with a harness and lead to secure him, with plenty of toys all around him. Some person made a complaint about us tying him up like a dog, but of course, as his mother, I knew he was happy and safe. Okay, we need to stop here for a second. 16 months old. 16 months. That's a year and 4 months old, and you are finding him across tracks and on top of buildings? That is insane. And then to tie him up to a house? Look, I myself never used a harness on any of my kids. I just kept the mom death grip on them at all times when we were out. But I personally was put in a harness when I was a toddler, and I know other parents who have used them. But I was never tied to a house or a structure and left alone. So while I personally don't like harnesses, I understand the use of them. But to tie your kid to the porch? Nah. Nah. Look, I don't want to throw any shade on Carlene here because she is also a victim in all of this, but some professionals might say that when a child is desperate for attention, they will do things that they are certain will get them attention, even if that attention is negative. To me, this sounds like there may have been some bonding issues between Carlene and Maurice and Martin, but I don't know because I wasn't there. It's just my opinion. When Martin attended public school, he was placed in the special education class. Special education classes. I love how we used to isolate and place on display all the children with learning disabilities or behavioral problems. That was a great decision. Well done, educators. Martin was disruptive and, according to his teachers, difficult. He was relentlessly bullied by other children, had a distinct lack of social skills, and overall hated attending school. Here again, we see the desire for attention. My guess is that when being bullied, the teachers were most likely ignoring it, because that's what usually happened back in the 70s. And desperate for one of the adults to help him, Martin started acting out. According to Martin, during his younger school days, no one wanted to be friends with him, and he could usually be found just aimlessly wandering around the playground. Other children would call out, "Silly Martin, no sense, no feeling." Man, kids are horrible. They've bullied the kid to the point where he just wanders around the playground alone because none of them want to play with him. So he's trying to stay away from them, but they just have to attack him a little bit more. Kids can be like a pack of hyenas pouncing on a baby lamb. I'm not trying to make excuses for what this shitbag does when he's older, but it is interesting to look at what happened when a horrendous shitbag was younger to try and see what might have pushed them down the path they ended up on. And remember, these are just my observations and my educated guesses. When Martin was 10, he managed to set himself on fire. He injured himself enough to land on the local news. Not just the story, but someone actually came to the hospital and interviewed Martin. Listen to his answers to the reporter.
Going up to the bedroom and I wanted to see, I had this light and I had this coloured skyrocket and I wanted to see if the wick went quick, so I lit it and it went fast and I tried to make it go out but I couldn't, and I broke the stick trying to get out but I couldn't, and it made a hole through my jeans.
You'll be in here for a while longer, won't you?
Yeah, about a week.
Do you think you'll be playing with firecrackers anymore?
Yes,
Don't you think you've learned a lesson from this?
yes, but I'm still playing with it.
Well, that was a little terrifying. I know I burned myself badly with firecrackers, and I know that I'll be in the hospital for more than a week, but I'm still going to play with fireworks. I'm getting inklings of sociopath here. Now, at this point in Martin's life, he is labeled as difficult, destructive, and disruptive. He has no friends, and he's being bullied. So a few years later, Maurice, his father, for some unknown thought process or reason, figured that by getting his son an air rifle for his 14th birthday, it would somehow solve all of Martin's issues. Sure. I can see how arming a child would solve his behavioral issues and make other kids stop bullying them. It's as clear as the nose on my face. Jesus Christ. Great idea, Maurice. Let's give the child a gun and see if he starts to behave better and make friends. More likely he'd start shooting all the kids that bullied him. Basically, Maurice has just told Martin that if life sucks and you're upset and sad and angry, shooting off a gun will make things all better. Shockingly, the plan didn't work. Instead of bringing Martin out of his shell and instantly making him a well-behaved and popular kid, all the gun did was give Martin an excuse to isolate himself more. But when Martin was isolating himself, he was now armed. Martin would spend hours alone in the woods shooting small animals and birds. His favorite pastime had now become shooting birds out of the trees and then killing them at very, very close range. Martin's destructive and harmful behaviors only seemed to increase as he went through public school and started high school. He was suspended for violent behavior against other students. And either right before high school or just after he started, Maurice and Carleen, both now growing more and more concerned about Martin's behavior, finally decided to take him to a psychologist for assessment. The testing came back that Martin had a low IQ, 66, which would put him well below average according to the current scales used in IQ testing. Martin was also diagnosed as displaying schizophrenic tendencies, which you should know that schizophrenia is rarely ever someone with 29 personalities. Those are extreme cases. Schizophrenics tend to have disorganized thinking. Sometimes they have hallucinations or delusions. They often seem to lose touch with reality, and that often makes day-to-day tasks extremely difficult for them to perform, such as getting out of bed, showering, getting dressed, brushing their teeth. Mundane things like that become huge obstacles for them. They often try and avoid eye contact with others and will rarely show emotions in situations. Schizophrenics often have difficulty holding conversations with others. It's a result of their disorganized thinking. The answers schizophrenics may give sometimes to questions may have nothing to do with the topic at hand, or they may not answer the question at all. They will often just simply isolate themselves from society. People with schizophrenia often don't know that they have it, and sadly, don't know to seek out treatment. And that is, in my opinion, perhaps the worst part about schizophrenia. Many schizophrenics have insurmountable trouble functioning and thinking, and they just come to accept that as their reality. They believe that that is just how it is. At this point in Martin's life, Maurice and Carleen have no idea what to do for their son. They started spending as much time as they could with Martin, nature walks and fishing trips. From what I've read, it seemed as though Maurice spent a lot more time with Martin than Carleen, as though he were trying to form a stronger bond between him and his son. Unfortunately, things only got worse with Martin's behavior as he got older. After starting high school, Martin was known throughout the school as a kid with peculiar and sometimes violent behavior. Kids in school nicknamed him the Shadow because Martin would hide or quietly sneak up behind someone and pounce on them, attacking them with absolutely no provocation. According to one psychologist, Mullins, Martin's behavior can be explained as that of a child who found himself inside a world that placed demands on him that he couldn't fulfill. Martin was overwhelmed and feeling helpless. His aggressive and violent actions were simply Martin attempting to regain his control over his own world and some power that he saw others having in the world around him. Martin would ridicule other students just as he had been ridiculed. Mullins believed that the behavior was a misdirected attempt for Martin to increase his level of self-esteem. Well, that's one theory. As they say, hurt people hurt people. This all sounds like a great diagnosis by Mullins, but teachers of Martin stated that he was building a profound hatred and resentment for his classmates, the school itself, and his teachers. So to me, this sounds like a little more than just a teenager trying to increase their self-esteem. I'm sure that was a part of it. Martin, however, had minimal interest in school or his education, and he would only participate or show interest in classes where he could be creative and be isolated from other students, such as woodshop and art class. School wasn't the only thing Martin was growing a hate for. The town of Port Arthur itself somehow ended up on Martin's hate list. Martin would ride his bike or walk the family dog around the ruins of the prison for hours alone. If he did come up on other people during his walks, it is reported that he would act aggressively towards them, shouting at them or threatening them with some type of harm. His sister Mindy worked in Port Arthur, and I think she worked at the waterfront. Martin could often be found walking around Port Arthur or seated in a cafe called the Broad Arrow Cafe. He would sit for hours and not speak to anyone. When he would sit out on the balcony of the cafe, he would pull out his air rifle and start shooting passing cars or people. If he wasn't shooting at the tourists, he would just spit at them. On Friday, May 6, 1983, the day before his 16th birthday, Martin dropped out of school. He couldn't read or write. In February of 1984, Maurice and Carlene took him to a clinical psychiatrist, a Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax. Carlene stated it didn't take him long to see that Martin had a problem. Martin was not able to concentrate on what Dr. Dax was saying and interrupted him to talk about the age of the house and the fireplace in the room. After a few more consultations, Dr. Dax said Martin would be unemployable as he would upset and annoy people to the extent he would always be in trouble. Martin would have to be put on a disability pension for life. Dr. Dax also made notes in Martin's file, quote, cannot read or write, does a bit of gardening, and watches TV. Only his parents' efforts that prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic, and parents face a bleak future with him, unquote. Wow. Just wow. That is quite the case note. What about offering some options for these parents, Dr. Dax? Some resources? Anything? I mean, I know we're in the 80s here, but come on. Well, he's a messed up kid, and there's nothing really that I can think of off the top of my head, being a psychiatrist and all, so I'm just going to write this one off as that family is going to have a miserable life with that kid. Jeez. By 1987, when Martin was 20 years old, his father had set Martin up with some gardening tools and told him to go out and offer to help the neighbors with their gardens or lawns or whatever, just to make a little extra money. Martin seemed to really enjoy this, and the side jobs seemed to keep him out of trouble, for the most part. But then Martin met Helen Harvey, a 54-year-old heiress to a fortune created by her father through working for a gambling empire. Helen was single and weird. She lived in a mansion with her aging mother and 40 cats and 14 dogs. That's right. Those numbers were 40 cats and 14 dogs. The smell alone would probably knock someone unconscious. Ew. Helen and her mother Hilza lived and occupied the top floor of the house, and they allowed the 14 dogs to have the run of the main level. Ugh. I just threw up a little bit in my mouth. Helen and her mother were pretty much recluses. Needless to say, they didn't keep the grounds of the mansion in good shape. So early in 1987, Martin was walking through the neighborhood and saw the lawn in need of mowing and decided to knock on the door. Helen opened the door and hired Martin instantly. But there was more than that. It was almost as if these two people, Martin and Helen, instantly understood each other with their eccentricities and need for isolation. According to Martin, Miss Harvey was his only real friend, and it was not a sexual relationship. Over time, Martin and Helen's relationship grew from groundskeeper and employer to excellent friends who were together all the time. Because of the friendship between Helen and Martin, Hilza was left alone more and more, and the state of the house was getting worse and worse. In fact, the house was disgusting and pretty much, you can imagine, a health hazard. Hilza moved from the top level of the house down to the kitchen on the main level with the 14 dogs. But when Hilza moved from the top floor down to the kitchen, Helen neglected to arrange a bed for her. So Hilza was forced to sleep in a chair sitting upright. While trying to sleep in the chair, Hilza would moan in pain and move around trying to find a comfortable position. What Helen and Hilza didn't know was that Hilza was moaning in pain because she had broken her hip about 2 years prior and had been living with that pain the entire time. The level of neglect of Hilza is completely off the charts, my friends. If you're keeping track, now Helen and Martin are both shitbags in this case. Finally, in June of 1990, someone called the health department for Hilza, as they hadn't seen any trace of her on the grounds in years. When the authorities entered the house, they were overwhelmed, first by the stench of dog shit inside the house, and then upon finding Hilza in her chair/bed in the kitchen. She was highly malnourished and suffering from infected leg ulcers. The smell. Oh my God. Helen herself wasn't in much better shape than her mother, and both women were taken to the hospital. The authorities placed a cleanup order on the house and the grounds, and the local animal shelters rounded up all the animals and took them away. Maurice and Martin took the cleanup jobs for the entire property on. So Maurice took a leave of absence from his work and started working with Martin at cleaning the property. The job took months to complete. 12 large garbage bins, like the kind that trucks have to bring, were taken just out of the house. According to one report, mold had been growing on everything inside the house, and it was so bad that there was a patch of mold that had grown so big inside the oven that it was making its way out the oven door. Oh, that's gnarly. Needless to say, everything inside the house was thrown away. When Helen was released from the hospital, she asked Martin to live with her at her home. I don't think Hilza ever left the hospital. I couldn't find an exact date of death for Hilza, but I think she passed away shortly after being taken out of the house. Now Martin is living with Helen in the giant mansion. Martin and Helen had a weird relationship. Since Helen's house was empty and she didn't have any clothes, she needed to shop. And that is exactly what the friends did. A lot. But even though the two were having fun shopping and spending Helen's endless supply of money, Martin's moods were turning for the worse. He was getting angrier and angrier. While Helen was driving the car, Martin would grab the steering wheel and pull it towards him, trying to make Helen crash the car or push it the other way so that she would swerve into oncoming traffic. This happened so many times that Helen started driving slow whenever Martin was in the car with her. It's reported that she never went over 60 kilometers an hour, which is about 37 miles per hour. According to another report I read, Helen told a neighbor, quote, "One day that little bastard is going to kill me," unquote. During this time, Helen changed her will and named Martin as sole beneficiary of her entire estate, naming Martin as her friend. She also named Maurice as trustee of the estate for Martin. Around the same time, Maurice was starting to worry about Martin as his behavior was deteriorating quickly and his threats of violence were increasing. But neither Maurice or Helen raised any alarms or said anything to anyone. At the same time, Maurice redid his will, leaving a fund of $250,000 to take care of Martin for life. So, with the trust fund from his father and the estate from Helen, Martin was now a millionaire in waiting. On October 20th, 1992, Helen was killed when her car veered over the center line and hit an oncoming car head on. The first people to arrive on the scene was a man who was driving with his daughter and his niece. He stated that there were 3 dogs in the back of the car that looked as though they had been knocked out by the crash, and Martin had also been knocked unconscious. But the instant the man saw Helen, he knew she was dead. According to the police report, Martin told them that Helen had been distracted by the 3 dogs fighting in the back of the car, and she turned to scold the dogs, and as she did that, she inadvertently turned the steering wheel into the path of an oncoming car. The results of the accident were horrendous. Helen's neck was broken, snapped when the 2 cars crashed, and one of the dogs had actually died in the crash. A second dog died because of its injuries later that night, and the third dog was injured but would eventually recover. As for Martin, he received 2 fractured vertebrae as a result of the crash. There are many who believe, as I do, that the cause of the crash did not rest on Helen's shoulders, but that Martin had yanked on the steering wheel in one of his rages or tantrums. He's 25 at this point and a complete shitbag. I wouldn't put it past him. After the accident, Martin had a long road of recovery, which didn't do him any favors in any way at all. He was regressing. He isolated himself inside the farm that he had inherited from Helen. Even though Maurice would come and take care of him, Martin fell into a deep, deep depression because he missed Helen. Once he was up and mobile, Martin was desperate to find a friend that would fill the void left by Helen's death. But instead of looking to people his own age or even older, he focused on younger children. Martin would go out into the neighborhood and nag children to let him play their games with him. Luckily, the children's parents had warned the kids about Martin and had told them to stay away from him. In one article, a neighbor stated that the children found Martin scary, even without the warnings from their parents. Thank God, 'cause that had a giant shitstorm written all over it. During Martin's recovery, Maurice was spending huge amounts of time at the farm, trying to pull his son out of this depression. And, of course, at the same time, manipulating everything in the world around Martin to make it as easy as possible for him to function as normally as possible. But Maurice was falling into a depression of his own. In a 6-month period, he had gone to his family doctor twice, complaining of deep sadness and anxiety. The neighbors of the farm were terrified of Martin and avoided him at all costs. They said he would approach them acting like a nice, pleasant young man and without warning would throw a tantrum or threaten violence. They said he would walk his property all night long, armed with a rifle. I think it was the air rifle that Maurice had bought for him, but nevertheless, it was a rifle. During the day, he would shoot the air rifle at tourists who would stop to buy apples from a roadside stand of one of his neighbors. On August 13th, 1993, Maurice left the family home and headed out to Martin's farm. Martin was due home that evening, but Maurice wanted to spend a little time alone before Martin got back. Carleen wasn't concerned about Maurice at all and kissed him goodbye. At about 7:30 p.m., Carleen received a phone call from Maurice, which was standard in the family. The rule was, whoever was traveling, you call when you get to where you're going. But on this phone call, the only thing Maurice said was, "I love you." Carleen thought he had maybe had a few drinks because in all the years they had been married, Maurice had never said, "I love you" on a check-in call. Maurice made another call that night to his daughter, Mindy, who was living in Queensland. On that call, he quietly said, "I love you," and very little else. The next day, August 14th, a man came to Martin's farm. He was there answering an ad for a horse trailer that was for sale. He walked up to the door and knocked. No one answered. It was then that he noticed a piece of paper nailed to the door. In handwriting, the words, "Call the police," were written on the paper. Police were called, and when they arrived at the farm, they found Martin cutting the lawn, unaware that his father had gone missing, or that there was a note nailed to his front door that instructed the finder to call the police. Searches were initiated, and it took 2 days to find Maurice's body. He was found in a dam located in a stream out the back of the farmhouse. Maurice was laying face down in about 3 meters or 9 feet of water. He was weighed down with a diving belt that belonged to Martin. The diving belt was wrapped around his neck and crossways over his chest. Maurice had a package of his anti-anxiety drugs in his pocket, and 18 of the tablets were missing. Maurice's death was ruled unnatural but not suspicious. And the reasoning behind this conclusion literally drives me insane. Maurice's death was ruled basically as a suicide because he was known to be on antidepressants. Can we just stop for 1 second and break this down? If someone is on antidepressant medication, it does not automatically mean that if they die suspiciously, they killed themselves. The beginning of the name of the pills is anti, meaning preventing or suppressing, reversing or undoing, meaning preventing depression or suppressing depression. Now, I know that antidepressants don't always have the intended effect on people, but just because a person is taking them doesn't mean they took their own life. And just because there were 18 pills missing doesn't mean that Maurice took them all at once. For all we know, he was on the 18th day of his prescription, or someone shoved them down his throat or disposed of the pills to make it look like he took them. I couldn't find a toxicology report for Maurice anywhere, but I would be very curious if there was ever one conducted and what the results of that said. Maybe he did take his own life, but a toxicology report would have told us that. For Martin's entire life, Maurice's single focus was to make it easier for Martin to fit in. Glide through society without the bumps and scrapes that others encountered. Every awkward silence was filled, every difficult conversation navigated, every potential misstep cushioned by Maurice's tireless intervention. With Maurice so completely focused on adapting the world around Martin, tragically, the foundational lessons every individual needs were overlooked. He neglected to instill in Martin the crucial distinctions between right and wrong, leaving Martin without a reliable moral compass. Equally absent was any guidance of emotional regulation, leaving Martin drowning in unmanaged feelings. Add these to the missing lessons of communication with other people, and the final product is the monster void of apathy that Martin Bryant became. Sit down, Karen. I am not trying to place all the blame on Maurice for the horrific things that Martin will do in a couple years. I'm simply displaying the backstory to the monster that we are looking at this week. I absolutely 100% understand Maurice's thought process in terms of protecting Martin and adapting the world around him. When you're a parent with a child with challenges, your instinct is inherently to protect your child, to allow them to function as all the other children do. I wonder if Maurice had come to the realization or the belief that everything he had done for Martin had failed, and instead of making life easier, which was his intent for his son, he had in fact turned Martin into an absolute monstrosity of a human being. And if that is the case, that would have been a giant contributing factor for Maurice in taking his own life. On the flip side of the coin, perhaps Martin had had enough of his father and murdered him and left the note on the door. But I kind of lean towards the first theory a little bit because parental guilt is a strong bitch and she will break you down until you are a pile of crumbs on the floor. But I am not ruling out that Martin murdered his own father. Now that Martin had lost both Helen and Maurice, the two people he was closest to in the world, he began to venture out a little more than what he had been into the world. And by the end of 1995, Martin had visited Europe 6 times and the US and Southeast Asia 3 times, as well as New Zealand and Japan. Martin also traveled frequently all over Australia. He would go to Queensland and South Australia, but most often to Melbourne, where he loved the zoo. Martin stated that the best part of his international trips was the long plane journey. He liked being able to speak to the people next to him. So he enjoyed a captive audience. While spending thousands of dollars on travel and ridiculously extravagant suits, Martin was also purchasing and stockpiling guns and ammunition. Like lots of guns. We're still in 1995, and Martin has now decided he wanted to be a surfer dude, but he didn't want to surf. He liked the look of the lifestyle, so he bought himself a surfboard. He grew out his hair, and then he tied the surfboard to the top of a yellow Volvo sedan, and that was it. The majority of the pictures you'll see of Martin, he's wearing this surfer look. In the early part of 1996, Martin advertised for a gardener to hire for his property, and the ad was answered by Petra Wilmot. Martin hired her for the job, but shortly after Petra started, she somehow became Martin's girlfriend. Petra testified at the trial to the oddities in Martin's behavior prior to the massacre, which I'm not going to get into because you can imagine what they were. Martin is a shitbag. I've given him enough time already, only because I wanted you to see that the backstory and those impressionable years are crucial in, shall I say, the output of an adult. On the morning of Sunday, April 28th, 1996, Martin loaded his numerous guns and ammo into his yellow Volvo with the surfboard still on top and left his home. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Martin walked into the Midway Point News Agency, which basically is a variety store, and purchased a cigarette lighter. Midway Point is a suburb of Sorel, which is a town about 23 kilometers from Port Arthur. The owner of the variety store, Angelo Casarios, hope I said that right, would later state that Martin, although often giggling inappropriately while in the store, was normally outgoing and pleasant. Apparently, Martin was a regular at this variety store. However, on April 28th, Martin made no attempt to exchange hellos or, according to Angelo, even offered recognition of Angelo. He simply picked up the lighter and placed way more money than needed to pay for it on the counter and left the store. Then Martin went to a grocery store in Sorel and purchased a bottle of tomato sauce. While shopping for the tomato sauce, Martin carried a large sports-type bag over his shoulder. The owner of the store remembered Martin because he seemed suspicious carrying the giant bag and walking around the store, so he had kept a close eye on him. Then Martin drove to Forset, a town about 8 kilometers southeast of Sorel. There, he stopped at a gas station and asked the owner, Gary King, for a cup of coffee. He also asked Gary not to boil the kettle quite as long as he had last week when Martin had come in for a coffee. He told Gary that he was going to Roaring Beach to surf, paid for his coffee with coin, and headed out. Gary would later testify that he had thought this was strange because that morning there was no wind and therefore there would be no surf. There were several other sightings of Martin in his yellow Volvo with the surfboard on top that morning. They all reported that his route was taking him towards Port Arthur, which was about 65 kilometers from Sorel, and the entire drive without stopping would have taken him approximately an hour. Before Martin arrived in Port Arthur that morning, he made a stop shortly after 11 a.m. at the Seascape Guest Accommodation, which is a bed and breakfast owned by David and Nolene Martin, aged 72 and 69 respectively. David and Nolene were celebrating David's birthday that day. Martin walked into the house and shot and killed both David and Nolene. Apparently, there was a piece of property that Maurice had wanted to purchase to build a house on, and David and Nolene had either beaten Maurice to making an offer or outbid him on the property. In any event, Martin believed that this was the reason that Maurice had taken his own life. And so naturally, Martin blamed David and Nolene for his father's death. That is according to Martin. A neighbor of David and Nolene testified that he heard 2 shots. Guests who had stayed at the bed and breakfast stated that on the morning of the 28th, they left the property around 11:15 or 11:20, and both David and Nolene were alive. So we know that Martin must have arrived somewhere in that time frame. I don't put much stock into this 11:15 or 11:20 because if you're on holidays, you're really not looking at the clock. They probably had to be out by 11. They probably drove away shortly after. So they're guesstimating 11:15 or 11:20. But we know that he killed them sometime in that half hour, let's say. Jason and Maureen Mason, tourists to the area, arrived at the Seascape Bed and Breakfast at approximately 12:30 p.m. They had seen the property as they drove past earlier in their trip and were thinking about renting a room. When they arrived, they noticed a yellow Volvo with a surfboard backed up to the front door of the house, and the driver's side door was open. As they approached the front door, they saw a young man with long blonde hair exit the house. Maureen described the young man, who, of course, was Martin, as making several jerky movements and couldn't hold still even while they were talking to him. Jason asked if they could take a look at the rooms as they were perhaps interested in renting for a night. Martin told the couple that he wasn't able to show them anything because he had his girlfriend inside the house and his mother and father were gone for about 10 minutes. Maureen testified that Martin was speaking as if something was wrong, that his tone of voice didn't seem natural to her, and she started getting an uneasy feeling, and all she wanted to do was get away from the house. She told Jason, "Come on, let's get out of here," and the two went back to their car and drove away. Maureen said that as they drove away, she looked back over her shoulder and saw that Martin was standing in front of the yellow Volvo, staring at them until they were out of sight. Okay, well done, Maureen, for listening to your gut, girl. Jason, for the rest of your life, you have to listen to what Maureen's gut is saying because her gut just saved your butt. At about 1:25, Martin pulled into a car park in Port Arthur and got into an argument with the attendant of the car park. Martin wanted to park his car down near the water, but the attendant told him no, that those spots were reserved for vans and campers. Martin spewed some curses at the attendant and then drove and parked in another area of the car park. But a few minutes later, the attendant saw that Martin had moved his car and parked it by the water. He saw Martin get out of his car carrying a large sports bag and a video camera. Thankfully, the attendant just watched Martin walk towards the Broad Arrow Cafe and didn't engage with him. According to court records, there were approximately 60 people inside eating or sitting on the patio of the Broad Arrow Cafe on April 28th when Martin Bryant walked through the door at 1:30. Martin walked to the counter and ordered some food and a drink. Then he went and sat at one of the tables out on the patio. He engaged in polite conversation with a young couple who were seated at the table next to him. He asked if they had had any issues with finding parking. Michael Beekman and Rebecca McKenna were the couple, and they told Martin that no, they actually didn't have any issues. Michael and Rebecca would later state that Martin appeared to be having a conversation with himself after they had finished the conversation about parking. Martin leaned over towards Rebecca and stated that there were a lot of Japanese tourists and wasps about. Michael and Rebecca said that Martin ate his food very fast, then picked up his bag and his tray and went back into the cafe. Once inside the cafe, Martin walked across the room to an empty table, placed his sports bag on the table, and pulled out an AR-15 rifle. According to court records, this gun holds 26 rounds of ammunition. As well, inside the sports bag was a hunting knife, a towel, and 2 lengths of rope. There was a couple sitting at a table near to where Martin had set his bag. When Martin set down the bag, he just started staring intently at Mr. Mo Yin and Miss Su Lang Chung. Once he pulled out the gun, he fired 2 shots instantly, killing both of them. Michael Sargent was sitting at a table with his girlfriend Kate Scott and another couple, John Riviere and Cara Villiers, and their table was very close to Mo Yi and Su Lang. When he heard the gunshots, Michael started towards Martin, but Martin turned the gun towards Michael and fired. The bullet hit the top of Michael's head, and Michael fell to the floor. Michael's girlfriend, Kate Scott, had been sitting with her back to Martin. When the shooting started, Martin shot Kate in the back of the head, killing her instantly. Kate fell to the floor, close to where Michael had fallen. Michael would later state that when he fell and saw Kate, for an instant he thought she was still alive. But when he tried to move her, he realized that she was gone. John, who had been sitting at Michael and Kate's table, had been walking back to the counter to order more coffee for his friends when the shooting began. John instinctively dove behind the counter and was peeking out to see what was going on. He would later testify that he could see Martin shooting the gun at his friends, and John stated that Martin was not saying any words, but instead maniacally laughing as he fired the gun. John testified that he could hear Michael, who was on the floor, screaming, keep down," as he watched Martin walk through the cafe, laughing and shooting people at close range, the majority of which were in the head. One man, Anthony Nightingale, was eating alone in the cafe. As Martin walked towards his table, Anthony stood up and screamed, "No, not here!" Martin shot Anthony in the neck, instantly killing him. Next, Martin took aim at a table with 10 tourists. He shot Kevin Sharp, Wally Bennett, and Ray Sharp. All 3 had been standing at the table, speaking with their friends when the gunfire broke out. Another man who was seated at the table, Gary Broom, was hit with a bullet fragment in the side of his face from one of the bullets that killed his friends. Thankfully, Gary would survive. One of the women seated at the table, Gay Fiddler, was also hit with bullet fragments in her back. Her husband, John Fiddler, who was sitting next to Gay, was hit with bullet fragments in the forehead and back. Both would survive their injuries. Martin then turned his attention towards another table. At this table are Tony and Sarah Kiston and their friend Andrew Mills. When the shooting started, Tony and Andrew stood up from their table. Tony pushed Sarah down to the floor and towards the door of the cafe. Martin shot both Tony and Andrew in the backs of their heads. According to several reports, Tony survived the gunshot long enough for Sarah to pull him into her arms, and he told her, "I'm going home to be with the Lord." Then he succumbed to the gunshot. Andrew was killed instantly. At a table that was in close proximity to Tony, Sarah, and Andrew's table were seated 2 women, Thelma Walker and Pamela Law, along with their friend Peter Croswell. Both Thelma and Pamela were hit with bullet fragments as Peter was pulling both of them to the floor and under the table. Both Thelma and Pamela would survive the shooting. On the other side of Tony, Sarah, and Andrew's table was a group of 8 tourists. Patricia Barker was located at this table with her husband Fred. Patricia was hit with some shrapnel in her arm, hand, and cheek. Investigators believe this shrapnel, like that injured Thelma and Pamela, came from the bullets that killed Tony and Andrew. It was about this time that people in the crowded cafe started to realize what was happening. Many tried to escape or hide, but Martin continued shooting indiscriminately at any target he could see. The majority of these gunshots are done at extremely close range, many people having the barrel of the gun against their heads. This came to light during the trial as the medical examiner stated that several of the victims had burns around their wounds from the barrel of the gun. So this shitbag is literally walking through this crowded cafe, just picking people off one by one and laughing while he's doing it. Graham Collier and Carol Lockton, along with Carol's 15-year-old daughter Sarah, were just beginning to leave their table as the shooting started. As Graham was standing up, he was shot in the neck. Carol and Sarah ran towards each other. Carol grabbed her daughter and pushed her to the floor. As she did so, she covered Sarah's body with her own. Martin walked over and shot Carol in the back and then shot Sarah in the head. Graham was rushed to hospital after the shooting was over and underwent emergency surgery and would survive. Carol survived the shooting, but sadly, Sarah died instantly by the gunshot wound to her head. At a table by the front window of the cafe sat Mervyn and Mary Howard, described as pillars of their church. Mervyn and Mary, both in their late 50s, had never traveled off the mainland of Australia before this 4-day holiday. Martin shot Mervyn in the head, killing him instantly. The bullet exited Mervyn's head and smashed through the window, narrowly missing Michael Beekman and Rebecca McKenna out on the patio. Michael and Rebecca were the couple that Martin had asked if they'd had any parking issues when he first arrived, remember? Michael and Rebecca immediately sought shelter under a table on the balcony. Martin moved closer to Mervyn and Mary's table and shot Mary in the neck. The shot didn't kill Mary, and Martin noticed this, moved closer, and shot Mary a second time in the head, killing her. After murdering Mary Howard, Martin started moving out of the cafe and towards the gift shop, which was attached to the cafe, and you could access through the cafe. Martin passed by a table of 8 tourists. One of the tourists, Robert Elliott, stood as Martin was walking by the table. Robert thought that by moving he might distract the gunman. Robert made a run for a brick fireplace that was in the middle of the cafe. As he did, Martin shot him once in the arm and once in the head. Robert would survive his injuries, but suffered numerous weeks of rehab and many surgeries. After shooting Robert, Martin moved into the gift shop. Working in the gift shop that day were Nicole Burgess and Elizabeth Howard. Both girls were standing at the counter. Martin shot Nicole in the head, killing her. Then he shot Elizabeth. But Elizabeth had turned to the side, and she was shot in her arm and chest. As Elizabeth began to fall to the floor, Martin shot her again in the chest, instantly killing her. Dennis and Coralie Lever had been traveling with friends Ron and Vera Jerry. After killing Nicole and Elizabeth behind the counter, Martin turned and shot Dennis Lever in the head, instantly killing him. Martin then took aim at a couple who were trying to shelter behind a display, Ron and Gwen Neander. He shot Gwen in the face. Gwen's lifeless body fell to the floor behind the display. After killing Gwen, Martin was distracted by something inside the cafe. He turned and fired a few shots randomly back into the cafe. One of those shots hit Peter Croswell in the butt as he was still hiding under the table with Thelma and Pamela. Jason Winter, who had previously been inside the cafe at a table with his wife Joanne and their 1-year-old son Mitchell, and Joanne's father, had left the table before the gunfire started and was now sheltering inside the gift shop with 2 other people. He heard the slight pause in shooting and thought that Martin had left the building. According to court records, Jason said to Dennis and Mary Olson, the couple he was hiding with, "He's gone." Then Jason stood up, and it is believed that Jason's movements must have caught the attention of Martin. Jason raised his hands and screamed, "No, no!" Martin then shot Jason twice. The first shot hit Jason's hand, neck, and chest. The second shot hit Jason in the head, killing him. Shrapnel from the bullets that killed Jason hit Dennis in the hand, chest, and left eye. Dennis would survive and was taken to hospital and released the next day. Martin then turned his attention to a group of 4 people who were huddled by the door of the gift shop. Ron Jerry, who had been traveling with his wife Vera, Nash and Pauline Masters, and a man who remained unidentified after the massacre. If you remember, Ron Jerry had been in the cafe and was traveling with his wife Vera and his friends Dennis and Coralie Lever. Dennis had been murdered in the cafe. Martin shot Ron Jerry through the neck, killing him. He then turned the gun towards Nash and Pauline Masters. Nash was trying to cover his wife's body with his own, but Martin was able to shoot Pauline in the cheek and aim the gun at Nash and shot him in the head. Both were killed. Martin then aimed the gun at the unidentified man that was huddled with Ron, Nash, and Pauline. Martin pulled the trigger, but the gun was out of bullets. The unidentified man took the opportunity and ran from the store. According to witnesses on the street, he came running out of the gift shop covered in blood splatter and told people that the gun didn't fire. Bridget Cook was working in the kitchen of the cafe when she realized what was happening. She and 3 other kitchen staff ran out the back door of the cafe. The 3 people who ran out of the cafe with Bridget took shelter behind some trees. Bridget ran out into the street where people were starting to gather outside the cafe to see what was happening. Bridget ran toward the crowds, yelling at everyone to hide and get away, that there was a shooter in the cafe. Bridget has balls of steel. As I said in the beginning of the episode, Port Arthur is a very big tourist attraction, and buses would park side by side in a special area of Port Arthur near the beach. Bridget ran towards this line of buses, screaming for everyone on the buses to take cover. Then Bridget ran to the back of one of the buses and used the bus as cover, along with a group of the tourists from the bus. After the gun misfired at the unidentified man, Martin left the Broad Arrow Cafe and made his way back to his car to retrieve another weapon. Once Martin had rearmed himself with a new gun, he made his way back to the patio of the Broad Arrow Cafe and stood facing the street. He started firing the automatic rifle indiscriminately up and down the street, just shooting people who were running to escape and hide anywhere they could. When Martin was finished firing randomly into the street from the patio of the cafe, he left the patio and began moving towards the line of tourist buses parked on the street. Remember, this is where Bridget had run to warn people what was going on. As Martin moved closer to the buses, some of the tourists that were on the buses were still making their way to the outside and back of the bus. The driver of one of the buses, Royce Thompson, was running down one side of the bus when he was shot in the back. After Royce fell to the ground, he was able to pull himself to the back of the bus and roll underneath it. Sadly, Royce died of his gunshot wound. Bridget and the tourists were moving around the buses, using them as shelter from Martin. So as Martin moved, they would move to keep the bus in between them and Martin. But then Martin walked along the front of the line of buses and just began firing into the groups. Bridget was shot in the right leg. According to the court records, Martin was using full metal jacket ammunition. The bullet entered Bridget's right leg and traveled straight through to embed itself in her left leg. Bridget would survive the massacre, but would have to undergo several surgeries. Martin continued firing at the group of tourists. Next, he shot Winifred Alpin in her right side, killing her. Another tourist in the group, Yvonne Lockley, was running near Winifred when she was grazed by a bullet on her cheek. Thankfully, Yvonne was able to hide and would survive the shooting. Neville and Jeanette Quinn, also tourists, were running from an approaching Martin as he was making his way through the bus parking area. Jeanette was shot in the back and fell to the ground. Martin then started making his way back to his car again. When he got there, he retrieved another gun. This gun is referred to in the court transcripts as something called a self-loading rifle. I have no idea what that is. I have no idea what the difference of that is compared to what he'd already been using. We just know that it's a gun. Once Martin had loaded the gun, he began firing back towards the cafe. Irene and Doug Hutchinson were running towards the buses to try and shelter inside. Irene was able to get to a bus and hide, but Doug was shot in the right arm, and the force of the shot knocked Doug to the ground. He then crawled and pulled himself down towards the beach and was able to hide there for the remaining of the massacre. Martin started to walk back towards the buses, firing randomly at people who were hiding behind anything they could find. As he was walking back to the buses, he walked past Jeanette Quinn, who had been shot in the back and fallen to the ground. Martin shot Jeanette again in the back as he walked past her without missing a step. There were 4 buses all parked together, and after shooting Jeanette, Martin walked on to one of the buses. Thankfully, there was no one hiding on the bus. When Martin realized there were no targets on the bus, he stood on the steps in the front doorway of the bus and started shooting at the bus next to the one he was on. Eva Gaylord was on that bus that was being fired upon and was shot through her arm and into her chest. Eva died instantly. On the same bus as Eva, Gordon Francis crawled to the front of the bus to try and shut and lock the door so that Martin couldn't come on to their bus. Gordon was shot in the shoulder, but he would survive the attack. Jeanette Quinn's husband Neville was still with the group of tourists that were using one of the buses as a shield. He realized that Jeanette was not with him, and he heard that the shots had stopped for a moment, so he decided to go back and find his wife. He ran around the bus and found Jeanette on the ground, but she had already been shot by Martin at this point and was unconscious. Neville heard the shooting start again, and he tried to pick up his wife to take her to safety when he realized that the last shot he had heard had landed just beside him. The next shot whizzed right past his head. Neville had to abandon Jeanette and started running around the bus again. Martin gave chase. Neville was able to get onto one of the buses and hide behind a seat near the back of the bus, but Martin had seen him and followed. Neville was on the floor hiding when Martin came into view. Martin stated to Neville, "No one gets away from me," and fired at Neville's head. By the grace of whatever being you believe in, Neville had moved his head just a titch as Martin pulled the trigger, and the bullet went into the fleshy part of his neck, missing anything major. The shot did paralyze Neville right away, but after about 10 minutes, he was able to move his body again. When he could finally move again, Neville made his way back out to Jeanette. He was able to hold on to her as she passed away approximately 15 minutes after Neville was able to get to her. After shooting Neville, Martin walked calmly and without emotion to his car. James Belasco, a tourist, was able to film Martin walking to his car from across the street. Just before Martin got into his car, he saw James and fired a shot at him. Luckily, the shot missed James and hit a parked car behind him. James took cover as Martin got into his car and drove away. They played the video in the courtroom, and in the video, Martin is devoid of emotion as he's walking towards his car, devoid of emotion as he raises the gun and aims at James, and devoid of emotion as he pulls the trigger. Many survivors of the massacre stated that apart from the hysterical laughing that Martin did at the beginning of the shooting, he showed no emotion, excitement, or even anger while slaughtering anyone that day. It was as if carrying out the massacre was part of a mundane routine for him. This phenomenon seems to happen a lot during rampage shootings, and there are several theories as to why. My personal opinion is that the shooters enter a somewhat of a fugue state. Now, normally a fugue state or a dissociative fugue is where a person will enter into a psychotic episode where they have lost awareness of reality. They will often wander aimlessly, unaware of what they are doing. They can carry out daily activities while in this state, but completely unaware of who they are, where they are, or what they're doing. For rampage shooters, in my opinion, it's that they almost force themselves into a dissociative state. They are aware of what they are doing, who they are, perhaps even where they are or where they want to go, but because their brain is witnessing trauma after trauma at a high rate of speed, they have to disassociate from the carnage in order to carry out their objective, which in most cases has been caused by rage, based for the most part on perceived wrongdoings done to them. And so they appear to be in a fugue state, but in actuality, their brain is simply attempting to protect them from the trauma it is witnessing. The brain is an amazing thing. According to the transcript records, and this will blow your mind, Martin was only in the cafe for 1 to 2 minutes total. And in that time, he killed 20 people and attempted to kill 4, wounded 6, and caused grievous bodily harm to 1. Maximum carnage. It was an absolute slaughter. The survivors stated that there was just so much gunfire coming from Martin that they couldn't hear anything else but gunfire, and Martin's maniacal laughter as he pulled the trigger over and over and over again. I want you to imagine 1 to 2 minutes. That's like a TikTok. And having 20 people killed in that time frame. 31 people shot in some way, shape, or form in the span of a TikTok video. That's how fast this was happening. That's why there was no informed reaction to Martin. No one could have tackled him in that amount of time. The amount of time it would have taken anyone inside that cafe to realize what was happening would have been 1 to 2 minutes. The people who were out on the streets of Port Arthur and up at the prison ruins heard the gunfire, and at first, many thought it was a reenactment of some kind. Apparently, reenactments were something that they would do from time to time at Port Arthur. But once people had realized that it wasn't a reenactment, Martin was already on the street shooting at people. Many of the people who were on the streets of Port Arthur started running towards the ruins to find shelter. The prison ruins are just a short distance outside of the town proper. It's a nice short walk or short car ride to the ruins. So that's why many people started running towards them. With the amount and the sounds of gunshots that were coming from the cafe, and if you add in an echo effect, many people who were on the street had no idea how many shooters there were or where the shooters actually were. They were just hearing gunshots from all different directions. There was a group of people running along the road heading to the prison when Martin drove out of Port Arthur. John and Carolyn Boskovic and Peter and Pauline Grenfell, a Mrs. Nanette McCack and her 2 daughters, Alana, aged 6, and Madeline, aged 3. This whole group was running together. Nanette was carrying Madeline, and Alana was running beside her mom. Caroline stated that she spoke with Alana as they were running, trying to keep the little girl calm. Nanette told Madeline, "We're safe now, Pumpkin," according to John and Caroline. When Nanette told Madeline this, Madeline snuggled in a little closer to her mother. Then a car stopped on the road beside Nanette and the girls. It was Martin. But Nanette hadn't seen Martin shooting inside the cafe or out on the street. It is believed that Nanette thought that the car was offering a faster escape for her and her girls. At the very least, she might have figured it would offer some shelter for them. The other people running with Nanette and the girls were either behind them or in front of them. And from their testimony, the people running saw Nanette approach the vehicle. Martin got out of the car and placed his hand on Nanette's shoulder, telling her to get down on her knees. Nanette was pleading with Martin, "Please, don't hurt my babies." Martin told Nanette 3 times to get down on her knees while she was begging for her babies' lives. Once Nanette was on her knees, Martin raised the gun and shot Nanette in the head, killing her instantly. Martin shot Madeline twice. The first shot was in her shoulder. The second was in her chest and abdomen area. This shot killed the 3-year-old. By this time, Alana had run away and was hiding behind a nearby tree. Martin then turned his attention to Alana. Still standing by the now deceased Nanette and Madeline, Martin raised his gun and fired 2 shots at Alana behind the tree. Both shots missed the girl. Martin then walked over to the tree, placed the barrel of the gun on Alana's neck, and fired. Alana's lifeless body fell to the ground. Martin walked back to his car, climbed in, and continued driving to the prison ruins. I fucking hate this guy so much. To enter into the prison ruins site, one would have to pay the entrance fee at a toll booth. Once paid, you would enter the grounds, park your car, and then wander the ruins. While Martin was slaughtering Nanette, Alana, and Madeline, a gold BMW paid their toll and entered the site, not knowing what was happening just a few meters from where they were. Inside the BMW were the owners, Ken and Mary Rose Nixon, and another couple, Robert and Helene Salzman, who were visiting from Switzerland. There was another friend inside the car, Jim Pollard. Once through the toll booth, Ken noticed another car, a red Holden Commodore, which is just a regular kind of sedan, backing up towards them. That is when they heard the gunfire. Ken threw the BMW in reverse, and both Ken and the driver of the red Commodore positioned their cars near the toll booth in an attempt to block the entrance to the ruins. Martin pulled his Volvo up to the BMW. Robert Salzman got out of the BMW and walked up to the driver's door of Martin's car to confront the person inside the Volvo. Martin and Robert were observed in what appeared to be a confrontation of some sort at the driver's door of the Volvo. After a few seconds of this, what appeared to be a heated discussion, Martin raised his rifle and shot Robert in the neck, instantly killing him. Jim Pollard, the other friend in the BMW, jumped out and, when he saw his friend struck down, started approaching Martin to confront him. Martin raised the gun and fatally shot Jim in the chest. Martin then walked around to open the door of the BMW and attempted to pull Helene, Robert's wife, from the car. Martin shot Helene in the neck as he was pulling her from the car. The shot was fatal. Martin then went around to the other side of the BMW. Mary Rose Nixon was still in the front seat and had been signaling cars and people who arrived at the toll booth to get away with her hands. Martin shot Mary Rose in her neck, severing her cervical spine, killing her instantly. Martin then dragged Mary Rose's body from the BMW and began transferring his guns and supplies from his Volvo to the BMW. While Martin is transferring his things from the Volvo to the BMW, Graham and Stephanie Sutherland, along with their two sons, Thomas and Stuart, turned off the highway and arrived at the toll booth to the ruins. Graham saw the cars blocking the entrance and the bodies on the ground, and immediately threw his car into reverse and slammed on the gas. Martin noticed Graham reversing and fired 2 shots at the car. The first shot shattering the windshield, spraying broken glass all over Graham and Thomas, who were in the front seats of the car. The second shot hit the driver's door. Graham drove his bullet-riddled car and family to a nearby service station. He stopped there to warn people of what was happening. As he was doing this, a couple in a white Corolla were leaving the service station. Inside the white Corolla are Glenn Pears and Zoe Hall. As Glenn was about to pull out of the service station and onto the road, Martin, now driving the BMW, pulled to a stop right in front of Glenn's car. Martin got out of the BMW, armed with one of his guns, walked to the passenger side where Zoe was seated, opened the door, and attempted to pull Zoe out of the car. Zoe started screaming hysterically. At this point, Glenn got out of the car and walked around to Martin and tried to calmly reason with Martin. Martin raised the gun towards Glenn and began pushing Glenn towards the BMW. Once he had gotten Glenn to the trunk of the BMW, Martin opened it and forced Glenn inside. He closed the trunk and then returned to Zoe inside the Corolla. Zoe had now moved from the passenger seat to the driver's seat, most likely in an attempt to put some distance between her and Martin. Martin, saying nothing at all, and didn't even bend down to look inside the car, raised the rifle and fired 3 times. All 3 bullets hit Zoe, killing her. Martin then ran back to the BMW and drove off at a high rate of speed, with Glenn still in the trunk. Witnesses testified that Martin was driving in the direction of the seascape, which is where he had murdered David and Nolene Martin prior to arriving at Port Arthur. Martin arrived at the Seascape Bed and Breakfast and pulled his car into the driveway, just off the road, and stopped. Once out of the car, he stood at the end of the driveway and started shooting at passing vehicles. In one of the vehicles was Linda White and Michael Wanders. Linda was driving. At first, she thought the blonde man she saw standing at the end of the laneway was shooting game and waiting for them to pass by. That is, until she saw him raise the rifle and start shooting at her and Michael. Linda was hit in her right forearm. She coasted down the road a bit, and her and Michael swapped spots so that Michael could drive. But when Michael tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. Not only had Martin shot Linda and blown out the windows, but he had hit something under the hood. Driving behind Linda and Michael was a car carrying 2 couples, Doug and Faye Horn and Neville and Helen Shilkin. Doug was driving the car, Neville was in the passenger seat, and the 2 women were in the back seat. As they approached the driveway to the seascape, they saw Martin was pointing a gun at the car. But before Doug could react in any way, Martin started shooting at the car. Martin hit the windshield, which blew into the car, mostly cutting up Doug's face and upper body, as Martin had actually aimed the gun at Doug's head. Doug drove past Martin and stopped behind Linda and Michael's car. Linda and Michael ran from their car and jumped inside Doug's car. Doug started driving again, but Faye told him to stop because he was bleeding so badly that he couldn't drive. So Doug and Neville swapped seats, and Neville drove them all to safety. Behind Doug Horn's car was a car being driven by Ann Wardle. She and 3 of her friends were out for the day. Inside the car, we have Ann, who's driving, Sylvia Riley, Mary Wartburn, and Joyce Maloney. As Ann was driving, she saw Martin shooting at the Horns' car and immediately stopped her car in the middle of the road. Ann threw it into reverse and started backing up. She steered onto the other side of the road and kept backing up until she was around a bend and out of sight of the shooter. Once there, Ann got out of the car and started flagging down every car that was coming up the road to warn them what was happening around the corner. Ann's car was shot by Martin, but thankfully he wasn't able to harm anyone in Ann's car. Coming up the road behind Ann and her friends was Simon Williams and his wife Susan. Simon was a Canadian embassy official. He came around the bend and saw Ann reversing up the road on the other side and was confused. When he brought his attention back to the road, he immediately saw Martin with a gun and Martin shooting at his car. Simon sped the car up in an attempt to get by Martin as fast as possible, but when Simon's car was even with Martin, Martin fired again. This shot blasted out the front passenger and driver's side windows. So the bullet literally went through the car right in front of Simon and Susan. Susan was hit with fragments from the bullet. The bullet fragments removed her pinky finger on her right hand completely. Simon was hit with bullet fragments on his left hand. After shooting at Simon and Susan, Martin got back into the BMW and drove into the Seascape property and parked in front of the main house, which is where David and Nolene's body were lying. Martin got out of the BMW and took Glenn out of the trunk and forced him at gunpoint inside the house. Martin handcuffed Glenn to something inside the house, then went back outside and poured gasoline all over the BMW and set it on fire. Constables Hyland and Whittle were the first two officers on the scene. When they arrived at Seascape, they saw the BMW on fire in front of the main house. Officers took cover behind their vehicles, which they had used to block the road at the entrance to Seascape. A third officer, Constable Allen, was just arriving at Seascape when 3 gunshots were fired towards his cruiser. At this point, the officers pulled back and took cover inside a ditch on the other side of the road from the entrance to the Seascape. This is now about 2 p.m. when Allen and Whittle jump into the ditch. So this has all happened so fast. The Special Operations team arrived on scene about 4:30, but Constables Allen and Whittle were lying inside that ditch until the Special Operations team was able to get them out, which was at 9 p.m. Because for those whole 7 hours, those 2 men were being fired at by Martin from the Seascape property. Apparently, the Martins, the 2 people that Martin had murdered earlier, were gun enthusiasts and had a huge stockpile of weapons and ammunition inside the main house. So it took a while for Special Operations to figure out how to get Allen and Whittle out of that ditch safely. And in the end, Allen and Whittle had to belly crawl 200 meters or 650 feet along the ditch to get to safety. So these 2 officers were in that ditch for a total of 9 hours, ducking pot shots from Martin. That must have been terrifying. What would a shooting rampage be without some ace reporter trying to get involved? Allison Smith was a reporter for ABC. She was on her way to Port Arthur when she got word of the shooting at around 2:10, 2:15. Allison started making phone calls. First, she was calling businesses in Port Arthur, trying to get someone to tell her about what had happened there. And then she decided it would be a great idea to try and call the shooter himself. So Allison dialed the Seascape. Martin answered the phone. He told Allison to call him Jamie, and then told her he was just having fun. Then Martin stated if she ever called again, he would shoot the hostages. Listen, I get that the media needs to do their job and report the news as to what is happening, and I get that news outlets want to get the inside scoop on things that are happening. But when you inject yourself into dangerous situations, you not only could get hurt yourself, but you put other people in jeopardy, like Glenn. A headquarters was set up, and a hostage negotiator was able to make contact with Martin over the phone. Martin told them that they should call him Jamie and that he wanted a helicopter to take him to Adelaide. When the helicopter arrived on the Seascape property, Martin promised to let the hostages go. You see, as of this moment, no one else knew that Martin had murdered David and Nolene Martins earlier in the day. So as far as the police knew, Martin had 3 live hostages inside the house: Glenn and David and Nolene Martin. But in actuality, Martin had no live hostages at all. Martin had murdered Glenn shortly after bringing him inside the main house. Throughout the night, Martin continued firing guns out of an upstairs window, but the police never once fired back because they still believed that there were 3 live hostages inside the house, and they were worried that they might shoot one of the hostages by mistake. At about 7:45 a.m. on April 29th, smoke could be seen coming from an upstairs window of the main house. Within a few short minutes, flames could be seen in the same window. And shortly after that, ammunition could be heard exploding. By 8:15 a.m., the entire cottage was engulfed in flames. And 10 minutes later, at 8:25, Martin was seen by an officer leaving the house, his clothing on fire. Martin took off all of his clothing, staggered a little bit, and then dropped to the ground. Martin was arrested and taken to hospital. Once the fire had burned itself out, the bodies of David and Nolene Martin and Glenn Pears were found inside the house, all burned beyond recognition. Later that evening, police attempted to speak with Martin in the hospital, but he was too sedated. They returned the next day, April 30th, and at that time, Martin was less sedated. When they asked him about what he had done, his response was that he knew nothing about the shootings at Port Arthur, and that he had been a long way away from Port Arthur surfing during the shootings. Martin informed the police that he had been unjustly accused. "Oh, okay, shitbag. You just remain in your little fantasy world there, thinking that denying being there is going to save you." What an absolute shit pig. On July 4th, along with his defense lawyer, during a taped interview with police, Martin admitted to kidnapping Glenn Pears and taking him to Seascape, and then setting the house on fire. But he still denied having anything to do with the shootings in Port Arthur. Initially, Martin pled not guilty to more than 50 charges. Eventually, Martin would change his plea and plead guilty to all charges related to the massacre in Port Arthur, the ruins of the prison, and Seascape. At the sentencing hearing, the judge handed down 35 life sentences and an additional 1,652 years in prison, all to be served without the possibility of parole. Martin is currently housed in the Risdon Maximum Security Prison near Hobart, Australia. He is now 58 years old, and as he should, he will remain there until his last breath on this earth. Let's end this horrific case on some positive notes. Just 12 days after the Port Arthur massacre, the Australian governments united to remove semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns and rifles from civilian possession. They forced people to wait 28 days to buy a firearm, and perhaps most significantly, called for a massive mandatory gun buyback. Australia's government confiscated and destroyed nearly 700,000 firearms, reducing the number of gun-owning households by half. In 2022 in Australia, there had been just one mass shooting since their gun laws had been passed, and gun homicides had decreased by 60%. In 1997, a year after the massacre, Walter McCack founded the Alana and Madeline Foundation. Walter is the father of Alana and Madeline, who along with their mom Nanette were murdered by Martin at the side of the road. The Alana and Madeline Foundation is still going strong today, which I will post a link to. The foundation was founded on the belief that all children should have a safe and happy childhood without being subjected to any form of violence. The following is taken directly from their website. Through care, prevention, and advocacy, we fight for children's rights to be safe, so their future is strong. We uphold the rights of children and young people to be safe, the right to be safe at home, at play, at school, the right to be seen and heard and valued, the right to go online without abuse, the right to go to sleep without fear, the right to heal, the right to grow, and sometimes the right to unconditional love of a teddy bear when needed most. We fight for these rights, not just because children are precious, they are, and not just because our instinct is to protect them from the world, it is. But because only when young people are safe can they also be happy, hopeful, and strong. Only when they're safe is their best future possible. That's why we're here, and why we do what we do. It's their right. It's our reason. The Alana and Madeline Foundation have a myriad of programs that they have created for children. Just some of the programs run by the Alana and Madeline Foundation are as follows. The Buddy Bags program. Buddy bags are backpacks thoughtfully packed for vulnerable children across Australia experiencing crisis, trauma, or just doing it tough. The Buddy Bag backpacks include new pajamas, socks, and underwear so they can dress in clean clothes, a toothbrush, toothpaste, face washer, and hairbrush to attend to their personal care needs, a book to relax the mind, a trauma-informed toy for healing play, and an all-important teddy bear to cuddle for emotional support. The Children Ahead program. Children Ahead provides intensive, long-term therapeutic support for children and young people to help them heal and recover from significant trauma or violence. This is an amazing foundation, and as I said, I will link it on our Facebook page so you can go and check out all the amazing things that they are doing. And that, my friends, is the case of the Port Arthur Massacre. My thoughts. This is one of the worst rampage shootings that I have ever studied. But as in most cases with rampage shooters, the red flags were there. These weren't just red flags, these were giant red blocks in the middle of the road. There's a lot to unpack with this case. So, to begin with, as I said earlier, I completely understand Maurice's desire to smooth things out for Martin the child. A combination of parental guilt and absolute loves makes any parent want to make things easier for their child. But by doing so, Maurice set in motion the making of a monster. Martin was, and I would imagine still, underdeveloped emotionally, lacking the basic ability to deal appropriately with any type of resilience against life's challenges. Martin emerged into young adulthood without the capability or experience to engage with others and the world around him. Where were the supports for this family? Why didn't anyone give them a book to read on dealing with their child with challenges, or even a class, or just something? Where was the community? The Bryants were left to deal with Martin on their own, and unfortunately, they were not properly equipped to do so. And so they did what they thought was the best they could do for their son with what they had available to them at the time. By gifting Martin a gun at such a young age, even an air rifle, without teaching him respect and healthy fear for weapons, the seed was planted long before the massacre happened. Listen, personally, I hate guns. And like Leonard Skinner, I wish every gun in the world could be melted in a giant cauldron and poured into the sea. But I know that is never going to happen. And I don't really have a problem with people owning and using guns for protection or hunting or even for fun. But by not holding respect for the power and potential for harm of guns, people's level of empathy for others lowers each time they pull a trigger. I believe by allowing Martin to use the weapon freely, killing animals with no consequences or lessons taught, Martin became a kind of hollow core. No empathy for others. Not even a modicum of awareness of others' pain, happiness, sadness. In fact, I would go so far as to say he was incapable of recognition of life within others. He saw people as a way to achieve his own goals and satisfaction. I think that Maurice and Carleen should have put a stop to the relationship between Martin and Helen. When I read about that weird, icky relationship that was created there, I was flabbergasted that it even happened. And it kind of changed my opinion of Maurice a little bit. I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but I will. I think that Maurice was blinded by the opportunity to possibly acquire Helen's properties and wealth. That is the only reasoning I have been able to come up with as to why he would allow Martin to move into Helen's house. The absolute slaughter, and that's what it was a slaughter, that Martin carried out in Port Arthur is a perfect example of worst case scenario as a result of the absence of boundaries being set in place by parents at a young age. We know that Martin is a self-serving shitbag, and that was proven at the end of the whole slaughter, because he didn't kill himself. He held his own life much higher than any other human's life. Now, some reports that I read stated that Martin had tried to take his life by setting himself on fire inside the house, and that natural human instinct to preserve is what made him leave the house, or that he wanted his death to be one last spectacle outside of the house that day, and walking out of the house was his final bow, so to speak, having people watch him burn. But I don't believe that for a second. I think Martin accidentally caught himself on fire while he was lighting up the house, most likely unknowingly splashing himself with whatever accelerant he was using, and when he lit the house, he also lit himself on fire. I think he came out of the house to save himself, to get help, because he knew there were tons of first responders out there who would put the fire out. No matter the theory or what the so-called experts say, there were warning signs. And if a child hadn't have been handed a gun freely without boundaries or lessons, the victims of the Port Arthur massacre may have lived full, happy lives. Wow, that was awful. I had never heard of this massacre, which shocked me because it was before Columbine and after the McDonald's shooting in California, two other horrible massacres, which we will cover someday. I've studied rampage shootings and mass shootings for years, and I can't believe I've never heard of this. Or if I had heard of it, I must have just not noticed it because it was in Australia. Maybe. A lot of my research centered around North America, so I probably would have passed over any information on something from Australia, but it's not in my brain that I knew about this. Wild. At the end of the day, no matter what we think, the fault of this horrific and senseless tragedy lies at the feet of the shitbag Martin Bryant. And he has the rest of his pathetic, skanky life to think about what he did inside a cold and lonely cell. Although, I've been thinking that because he's in Australia, maybe the authorities there should think about throwing him out in the outback alone with no supplies and just letting nature take its course. And with that, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap test done, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.